Easter, Epiphany, is the oldest season of the church year. In Asia Minor and Egypt, it was begun celebrated around the 2nd century. The festival of the Epiphany fell and still falls on January 6th. And at one time, it was what was called a unitive festival. In other words, both the birth of Jesus Christ and the baptism of Jesus Christ was celebrated on January 6th. That's right, Jesus' birthday was not always celebrated on December 25th. The unitive festival of Epiphany was divided over a calendar issue, and Jesus' birthday was celebrated on December 25th, and the Eastern Church decided that they were going to continue to celebrate Epiphany as the baptism of the Lord. But the Western Church said, no, we're going to save baptism of the Lord for another Sunday, and we're going to make January 6th a season of celebrating the coming of the Magi with their gifts. And that's a significant thing to note in the history of the church. The account is recorded only briefly in one gospel, and never again mentioned throughout the New Testament. But this lovely account of Bethlehem's star, of adoring wise men, of fabulous gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, strange as it all may seem, is surely cherished by many Christians. We decorate our homes, our hearths, our altars, our Christmas trees with the star. And the events that inspired hymn writers are continued to this day as we've sung some of those hymns this morning. But why is Epiphany important? The Epiphany is the core meaning of our Christian mission. The star shining forth, and that's the literal translation of Epiphany, shining forth, guided the first Gentiles, Magi astrologers from the east, to Jesus, who the gospel writer John depicts as the one true light who gives light to everyone. The Christian mission is the spreading of that light. Now, to call Jesus light is not to equate him with some ancient Thomas Edison, but is to say that Jesus is God's revelation of God's self. That revelation had previously been given only to the Jews, but now God's revelation is to the Gentiles as well. God's revelation in the Old Testament included a promise of the coming Messiah. That promise had been made solely to the Jews. First Abraham, and then to Moses, and then David, and accordingly to all the Jewish people. In other words, the Jews, possessing and believing in the promise of God of a coming Messiah, had the credentials to be considered God's children. And if a Gentile wanted to become a child of God in the Old Testament, he or she must accept Jewish beliefs and the accompanying practices of the Jewish faith in order to secure the needed credentials. But with the arrival of the Magi at Jesus' house, it signified that no longer did Gentiles have to accept Jewish practices to become children of God. Now, new credentials were available. Humorist Robert Orban says that when he was in grade school, he was told that if he wanted to get a good job, he had better go to high school and graduate. So he went to high school. And when he was in high school, he was told, when you graduate, you probably ought to go to college if you want to get a good job. And so he went to college. And when he was just about ready to graduate from college, he was told, everybody has a bachelor's degree. You ought to go and pick up a master's degree. And so he got his master's degree. And then he was told, after acquiring his master's degree, that was only going to take him so far, so he should get a doctorate. And so he got his doctorate, and he went out looking for a job, and he was told they were looking for younger men. But having the right credentials is important. Employers want to know that you've been to the right school and that you've gotten a proper education. Dr. Robert Schuller was so fond of saying, the tassel is worth the hassle. Of course, it's possible to overdo it, witty limerick says it best. A girl at Bennington named Louise, weighed down with MAs and PhDs, collapsed from the strain, said her doctor, it's plain, you are killing yourself by degrees. Still, it is very, very clear. Having the right credentials is important. We need to acknowledge that people without proper credentials have done untold harm. You may remember the story that's been told on Billie Burke. Remember Billie Burke? Famous actress, best known for her role as Glinda, right? The good witch of the north from The Wizard of Oz. And while Billie was enjoying a transatlantic ocean trip, she noticed that the gentleman at the table next to her was suffering from a bad cold. Are you uncomfortable, she asked sympathetically, and the man nodded. Well, I'll tell you what you should do for that, she offered. Go back to your stateroom, find as much orange juice as you can and drink it. Take 2 aspirin, cover yourself up with all the blankets that you can find. Sweat that cold right out of you. I know just what I'm talking about. I'm Billie Burke from Hollywood. And the man smiled and then introduced himself in return. Thanks, he said. I'm Dr. Mayo from the Mayo Clinic. Credentials protect us from charlatans and incompetence. We want to know that our doctor is licensed, don't we? Also our pilot, our realtor, maybe even our beautician. We want to know that our lawyer has been admitted to the bar and that our pastors have been ordained. Credentials are important. So what are the proper credentials of a Christian in 2015? The Apostle Paul was continually having to establish his credentials. It seems absurd to us. I mean, more than anyone else, Paul was responsible for the spread of Christianity throughout the known world of his day. You know his story. How he persecuted the early Christians, but then he met Christ on the road to Damascus. His life was so radically changed that he became the great missionary to the Gentiles. Much of our New Testament, in fact, indeed, much of our Christian theology comes from letters that Paul wrote to various churches, the church at Rome, the church at Corinth, the church at Thessalonica, and so forth and so on. Surely this man had a forceful impact on our Christian faith. Why was it necessary for him to continually establish his credentials? Because the people of his day were not aware of what we are aware. It was important for him to open up his letters, like the letter to the Corinthians, which we read earlier this morning, to establish his credentials. Look at what he writes. Paul, called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God. Kenneth L. Chafin, in his commentary on 1 Corinthians, notes that Paul identifies himself differently depending upon how the people to whom he's writing view him. If Paul is writing to a church where his authority is in question, he oftentimes identifies himself, Paul, an apostle, thereby reminding them of his credentials and of his holy calling. If Paul is writing to a church that has full confidence in his ministry, then he just simply introduces himself as Paul. And in this letter to the Corinthians, he quickly identifies himself as an apostle because Paul knew it was important that he establish his credentials. What were Paul's credentials? I mean, what gives him the authority to speak for Christ? Well, the first credential, of course, was his calling. Paul begins his letter, remember, like this: Paul, called to be an apostle of Christ Jesus. Studs Terkel, who was an author and had a long-running radio show in Chicago at one time, said something very striking. I think most of us are looking for a calling, not a job. Most of us, like the assembly line worker, have jobs that are too small for our spirit. Jobs are not enough for people. My guess is that that's true. Many of us want to believe that there's more to life than just our jobs, especially when those jobs are over and we are experiencing retirement. God has more in mind for us than just our job. We must recognize and believe that we have a calling from God that is lifelong. In some cases, that calling may be synonymous with our jobs, as Linda and mine are at this time. Or it may be a calling that is so much larger than our job. The call to love our family, to be a great dad, to be a great mom, to be a great grandparent. The call to serve our community. The call to be an elder, to be a deacon, a leader in the church. See, the first credential that Paul had was a calling from God. But there was a second. Paul had the credential of a changed life. People are called by God every day, but I'll let you in on a little secret. Only a small percentage respond to that call. And fewer still have their life changed by an intimate relationship with Jesus Christ, like Paul had his life changed. I mean, Paul, the persecutor of Christians, becomes Paul, the apostle of Christ. Paul's story is like that of Gary Adams of Asheville, North Carolina. Gary didn't have much need for God. He had attended Sunday school as a child, so he knew the basics about the Christian faith and about God. But as he reached adulthood, he saw very little need of a higher power. God was, as he put it, irrelevant to his life. But Gary got along well with his two co-workers. These were two men who were very enthusiastic about their faith. One thing all three men had in common was their sense of adventure. And on December 23rd, 1996, the three of them went caving together in North Carolina. One of them had heard that in one of the caves there was a hidden waterfall, hidden deep inside the cave, and these three men were determined to find it. But while climbing a rope ladder in one of the caves, Gary lost his footing. He fell 50 feet to the floor of that cave, knocked himself out. And when he came to, he didn't know where he was. And worse than that, he didn't know who he was. Gary was completely confused. But as he lay there praying, something left over from his childhood came to mind. He knew that he ought to pray, and so he began to pray. And according to his own testimony, later on, he prayed, "Lord, let me live long enough to find out who I am and what my life is about." And he said, suddenly a great peace overcame him. He writes that he suddenly felt complete and whole. And when the paramedics finally reached Gary, one of them said his name, "Are you Gary Adams?" And suddenly Gary remembered who he was. The Gary Adams who came out of the cave that day was not the same Gary Adams that had gone in. He was now a man who belonged completely to God. But, as he says, he had to forget himself. He had to forget his old self, quite literally, before he could realize who God really is and find his new self. Gary Adams experienced the kind of turnaround that Paul did on the Damascus Road. Now, it's hard to argue with lives that have been radically changed, like Gary and like Paul. It's one of the credentials of a Christian, however, a calling from God and a life that has been transformed. And there's been a radical change. Paul also had the credential of a strong character. Paul in verse 2 uses the word sanctified. Now, sanctified means set apart to God. In the Old Testament times, sanctified persons, places, and things were never used for profane or ordinary purposes. No one ever accused Paul of being ordinary. In other words, character counted so very much as Paul was concerned. One of the reasons for the decline of the American spirit, writes Richard Capon Jr. in his book, Finish Strong, is a pervasive loss of trust. Everywhere we look, we find evidence that no one trusts anyone anymore. Now, if you think that's an exaggeration, I would invite you to head out to your favorite supermarket this week or your favorite department store. Look to the ceiling, to the corner, to one of those little black globes concealing a security camera. We no longer seal our marriages with a kiss. There was a very prominent wedding that just took place 2 weeks ago, that in the middle of the wedding, they signed a prenuptial agreement. And banks, they delay cashing your checks, don't they? Why? Because they don't trust you. They're customers. They don't trust you. Capons asks in his book, are we all really that dishonest? Evidently we are. In the field of medicine, researchers at the University of Pittsburgh found that up to 20% of its doctor applicants for training fellowships lied about their research credentials. 30% said that they had published articles in journals that didn't even exist. Would you want any of those people cutting you open in the OR? But doctors aren't the only culprits. Reader's Digest, about 15 years ago, dropped 120 wallets containing identification of the owner inside the wallet, each with $50 in cash, on the streets of 12 large and small cities across the country. Their purpose was to test honesty in America. Do you know how many wallets were returned? About 67%, indicating that according to this very unscientific measure, we are about 67% honest. Now I ask you, how would you feel about someone who finds $50 on the street and keeps it? How trustworthy would you think that person is? Back in the 1990s, the Roper organization surveyed the public about its perception of who's telling the truth. In this study, people said that the clergy told the truth about 49% of the time. Doctors, about 48%. Their best friend, 26%. The local newspaper, 8%. The President of the United States, 8%. And the leaders of Congress, 3%. And I'm sure it'd be worse today. What a terrible indictment of our culture. But what about you? What percentage of the time do you tell the truth? Paul had the credentials of a calling by God, a radically changed life, and a rock-steady character. Finally, Paul had the credential of an unfailing commitment to Jesus Christ. Other people called by God might fall beside the way, but not Paul. He was in there for a lifelong haul. He had trusted his life to God, and he was not going to turn back. Theologian and Professor Lawrence Richards once said, in rock climbing, there's something called a commitment move. You're tied to the ropes, and there's a moment when you're standing, and you have to let go of solid ground to move to the next higher place. And it's a very scary step for many. You must trust that to which you are tied more than that upon which you are standing. And Jesus offers us the exact same lesson. The one to whom you are connected, Jesus Christ, must be trusted because he is far greater than any circumstances in your life upon which you stand. Have you made that kind of commitment to Jesus Christ, like Paul made, like Gary made? When you do, you will find that to which you are tied, Jesus Christ, is more than that upon which you are standing in this life. This morning I've listed 4 of Paul's credentials, but really they are 4 credentials for any follower of Jesus Christ. A sense that God has a calling for you that is lifelong. A radical change in your life, a transformation as you seek day by day to become the person that God has called you to become. That you possess a rock-hard character that cannot be shaken. So when people see you, they see evidence of the fruit of the Spirit in you and a lifelong commitment to walk in Jesus' steps. Credentials are important. And when someday that you stand before Christ, what credentials will you have to offer?